In this third of a four-part interview with Robyn Fivush and Marshall Duke, professors of psychology at Emory University, they explain the psychological mechanism at play when we hear a story and how these stories allow us to make analogous connections that give children the ability to build a moral framework of behavior that gives them a sense of their place in time and history. So let's get to it. It's interesting. I think that, we're born into a story that's already ongoing, and we
Yeah.
come into the world relatively storyless, and we don't have any experiences to draw on. Say a little more about how these stories, in a sense, go into the psyche of a young person and become a touchstone for them when they face challenges and difficulty, especially when you start thinking about resilience and self-esteem, which you talk about being one of the big outgrowths of hearing family stories. So how are these working? Do you have any sense about that?
We in many of the stories that the adolescents tell us about their parents or their grandparents. Most of my research is focused on stories of parents growing up. Marshall has worked more with the grandparent stories, but we often get the adolescent or young adult making an explicit connection between themselves and the parent. And I'm like my mother. I'm like that too. Like she told me the story about how she always fought with her brother, and growing up, that her brother always teased her, and maybe telling a particular story about a particularly bad fight that she had with her brother. But the end of the story is, and I fight with my brother too, but I love my brother like my mother loved her brother.
Hmm.
That kind of an explicit connection is not uncommon in these stories, and the adolescents who make more of those kinds of connections are showing even better outcome than the adolescents who don't make that explicit connection. So again, it goes back to this idea that the story is being integrated into, it may not be my story, but my mother's story or my father's story or my grandparents' story tells me about who I am as a person. I am like this. This is the kind of person I am.
Hmm. Any thoughts
And, and,
about that,
and
Marshall?
I would add to that the kids develop, I think, a sense of the story in that they feel a, a sense of ownership. They may not own the experience, but they own the story of the experience. And that belonging to them, this story now takes on greater power, because what they see is that they have a responsibility to the story, to live the story, as Robyn says, to be like the family. This is my story. They also have a responsibility for the story. That is, this is, as you said, they have joined this story and it's already going on. But when they join it, they have a responsibility to and for it. That is, it has to be maintained in the way it has been. And when I pass it on, I can't change it dramatically. I can change it for the better, perhaps, in a way that the family would appreciate. But I have some responsibility for it, and the ownership idea is something that I learned when I was talking with some grandchildren up in New York, adult grandchildren. And they said, we have stories about the Holocaust, for example, of what happened to our grandparents. And their stories were very small, very short, perhaps a few sentences. And I said to them, if I took a group of people at random and took them to a Holocaust museum and I showed them what happened and I told them just the story of this, and I asked them afterwards, can you imagine that your grandparent was in the Holocaust? Can you tell me a story? Any of the kids could probably create a story. And I said to the grandchildren, I said, well, what's the difference between the story they tell and the story which is about the same? And they said, we own our story.
Hmm.
and they don't own it. And once you take ownership of the story, I think then it has the power to produce the effects that we've seen, that I am part of an intergenerational narrative, which is mine. It's mine. And as such, there are certain things that come to me because of it, and certain responsibilities that fall upon me because of it.
And it's not just stories of trauma that operate this way.
No.
I'm thinking of a lot of the stories that we get. I mean, we live in Atlanta. We collected a lot of all of our early data was collected in the greater Atlanta area, although we've expanded. But, we would ask adolescents about stories they know about their parents or grandparents. Many of those stories were stories of the civil rights movement, or, the first, like my father told me when he was a child, his father took him to hear a speech by Dr. King, right? Those stories provide not just a placement in history, but it places the child in a moral stance to what they also must do to preserve that history and to advance it. And I think we see that even in small ways, whether it is actually an event as horrific as the Holocaust or a social movement like the civil rights movement, even in the small stories, these are stories that place the child in a historical timeline with a stance both to the past but also to the future.
This is so fascinating to me. And I often wonder and worry about children who don't have the stories, who've grown up in families, and I think about, in fact, I just was reading the Times the other day, and teen suicide seems to be on the rise, and it's probably exacerbated by some of the dynamics of what's happening today. But what happens to children who don't have the stories when they face challenges? When they don't have that reservoir of tales to call on? Have you been able to do any research on
that? The research that I began with the Holocaust grandchildren was based upon their not having stories. Because there was a group where the relationship that we had really uncovered was not holding. Many of them, in fact, more than you would imagine, just in terms of population distribution, are high achievers, are doing quite well, are very well adjusted, and they know very little about their family history. And this goes also, by the way, for people who are grandchildren of World War II or Korean War veterans, or anyone who has been in a situation which they don't want to talk about. And what happens is that a double wall of silence develops. The grandchildren or the children don't ask. The people who experienced it don't want to tell. Everybody just leaves it be. So there are groups of people who don't know the stories of what happened. But what we do find is that they are still very interested in generating some sense of their family's narrative. And what happens is they fold into the family narrative an encapsulation of a time period or an experience, which is left to just sit. And one of the most amazing quotes that I read from a grandparent, a Holocaust grandparent, was, "I have found a way in my life to have the Holocaust experience live beside me, not inside me." In other words, it's there, but it's encapsulated. And I think what happens is that kids are going to look for stories if they can. They're going to understand if they don't have a story. But there are also grander stories that are available to us that go beyond the family. There is an American story. There is an Atlanta story, which includes Dr. King. If you're a Georgia fan, it includes Herschel Walker, no matter when you were born. These are sources of stories that exist. It's not just the family narratives. is this the way an American acts? Is this the way a bulldog acts? So the stories are still there. But I think what we're looking at when we look at the family stories is a very special kind of story that is unique to this group of people. But the idea that having a sense of where we come from and who we are and how we're supposed to be, I think that exists on multiple levels in everybody's life. And you can start at a national level and you can move on down to a state or a city or a neighborhood and to a family and to a nuclear family. But the same process is still there.
Hmm.